It is the year 1348. You are locked inside your stone castle, and outside, the world you once knew has effectively ended. Every morning, you check the village gates, hoping to see signs of life, but there is only silence. You are not waiting for a doctor, there are none left. You are not waiting for a king. He has already fled. In the shadows of these damp stone walls, you realize that the most terrifying thing isn't the plague. Itself, it's the realization that no one is coming to save you. This is the story of a nightmare that changed humanity forever, told from the perspective of those who watched it unfold. Now here's the part that would really get to you. You haven't seen your neighbors in days, maybe weeks. At first, you thought they were just staying inside because of the cold. That's normal. But then, no smoke from their chimney, no footsteps, no voices, nothing. And deep down, you already know. They didn't leave, they're just not there anymore. Let's be real for a second. If you were living in medieval Europe during the Black Death, you wouldn't even know what a bacteria is. You wouldn't know about rats, or fleas, or infection. All you would know is this: people get sick, and then they die. Fast, sometimes in a few days, sometimes overnight. No explanation, no warning. And the worst part, it doesn't look like a normal illness. At first, it's just a fever. You'd think, okay, maybe I'll recover. But then come the swellings, painful lumps, under your arms, on your neck, in your groin. They grow, darken, turn almost black. And that's when people start whispering a word you never want to hear. Cursed. Here's a shocking truth most people don't realize. During the Black Death, entire villages didn't slowly fade away. They just stopped existing. No dramatic endings. No final goodbyes. Just silence. Historians later found places where food was still on the table. Doors left open. Animals wandering freely, as if everyone just vanished. Now imagine you're inside a castle. Sounds safe, right? Thick walls, heavy doors, guards. But here's the twist. Those same walls that protect you also trap you, because once the sickness gets inside, there's no escape. You're sitting there, back against the cold stone wall, trying to stay quiet, trying to listen, comma, and that's when you hear it. A sound, not loud, not clear, just something. From the other side of the door, at first you tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe the wind, maybe the wood shifting. But then it comes again, a faint, dragging noise, and then a soft knock. Here's the thing about fear in the medieval world. It wasn't just about dying. It was about not understanding why. Because if you don't understand something, your mind fills in the gaps. Some people believed it was punishment from God. Others thought it was poisoned air, or demons, or witches. And honestly, when you're sitting in a freezing room, hearing something on the other side of a door, any of those explanations start to feel possible. You hold your breath, the knocking stops. For a moment, everything is still again, to still, and then you hear breathing, Not yours, someone else's. Right outside. Now here's a detail that makes this even worse. During outbreaks, people would sometimes lock doors from the outside to keep the infected in, not to protect them, but to protect everyone else. So if someone inside got sick, they weren't leaving, ever. And suddenly, a thought hits you. What if the person outside isn't trying to get in? What if they're making sure you don't get out? Your heart starts pounding. You move closer to the wall, press your ear against the cold stone, trying to hear more, trying to understand, because in this world, information is the only thing that might keep you alive. And that's when you hear it clearly. A whisper, weak, broken, but human. Help. Now pause for a second, because this is where things get really uncomfortable. In modern times, helping someone is the obvious choice, right? But in 1348, helping someone could mean you die too. People had to make decisions that go completely against instinct. Parents avoiding their children, friends abandoning each other, doors staying closed, even when someone is begging outside, not because they were cruel, but because they were terrified. Here's another shocking fact. There are historical accounts of people who survived the plague only because they refused to help anyone. Let that sink in. Survival wasn't about bravery. It was about distance. So now you're there, hand on the door, hearing someone barely alive on the other side, and you have to decide, do you open it? Or do you stay silent and hope the sound eventually stops? Because one way or another, it will stop. And the scariest part? You won't know if you made the right choice. That's life in 1348. Not heroic, not dramatic, just quiet decisions with irreversible consequences. And we're just getting started. Because in the next part, people will try to fight something they don't understand, using methods that might actually make things worse. Alright? Let's stay in that moment for a bit longer. You're still there, hand hovering near the door, hearing that weak voice outside. And here's the uncomfortable truth: most people didn't open it. Not because they were heartless, but because by 1348, people had already started to notice a pattern. Anyone who got too close got sick. Anyone who cared for the infected followed them shortly after. There are real accounts from that time describing how even priests, people whose entire role was to comfort the dying, started refusing to come near. Think about that. When the people whose job is literally to help the sick begin to step back, you know something has gone terribly wrong. And here's a shocking fact. In some cities, so many priests died from last right's visits that there weren't enough left to bury the dead. So bodies just stayed where they fell. Now imagine how fast that changes the way you see the world. Suddenly, kindness becomes dangerous. Touch becomes suspicious. Even breathing the same air as someone else starts to feel like a risk. People didn't understand germs, but they did understand that something invisible was spreading. So they came up with theories. Some believed it was bad air, a poisonous mist drifting through towns. Others thought it was a divine punishment. And when humans don't understand something, they don't just sit quietly, they look for something to blame. This led to one of the darkest parts of the entire period. Communities turning on each other. There are records of entire groups being accused of poisoning wells or spreading the disease on purpose. And here's the disturbing part. Many innocent people were punished or killed, not because there was proof, but because fear needed a target. It's easier to point a finger than to accept that something uncontrollable is happening. Back inside your stone room, time feels strange. Minutes stretch into hours. You're not hungry, you're not tired, you're just waiting. Waiting for the sound outside to stop, and eventually it does. No final words, no dramatic ending, just silence again. And somehow that silence feels heavier than the knocking, because now your mind starts filling in the blanks. Did they die right outside your door? Did someone come and take them? Or are they still there, just too weak to make a sound? This is what fear does when there's no information. It creates possibilities that are often worse than reality. And here's something people rarely talk about during the Black Death. Psychological stress alone was enough to break people. Chronic fear, isolation, and uncertainty caused people to lose sleep, stop eating, and in some cases, simply give up. Survival wasn't just physical, it was mental. Now, let's zoom out a bit. Because what's happening to you inside that castle isn't unique. It's happening everywhere. Cities that once held tens of thousands of people are suddenly losing half their population. In places like Florence, it's estimated that up to 60% of the population died. Think about that. More than half of everyone you know gone. And not over years, but within months. Graveyards couldn't keep up, so mass graves became the solution. Large pits where bodies were stacked, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes without even names. And here's a chilling detail. In some areas, people stopped ringing church bells for the dead, not out of respect, but because they would have never stopped ringing. Death became so constant that it lost its ritual. It became normal, comma. And this is where something shifts in human behavior. When death is everywhere, people start reacting in extreme ways. Some become deeply religious, praying constantly, hoping for mercy. Others go the opposite direction, living recklessly as if nothing matters anymore. There are historical descriptions of people abandoning all sense of routine, throwing feasts, ignoring rules, spending everything they had, because tomorrow was never guaranteed. Imagine that mindset. You wake up every day not knowing if it's your last, surrounded by silence, fear, and the absence of people who were just there yesterday. And slowly your world shrinks from a bustling community to a single room, to the space between you and a door you're too afraid to open. And the worst part, you still don't know what's causing any of it. But don't worry, because in the next chapter, people are finally going to try and fight back in a way that feels logical to them, but might sound completely bizarre to us. Alright, now here's where things start to feel almost surreal, because at some point, people in 1348 realized they couldn't just sit and wait. Anymore, they had to do something, not because they understood the disease, but because doing nothing felt worse. And this is where you start seeing figures appear in the streets that, if you saw them today, you'd probably think they came out of a nightmare. Long black robes, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and most strangely, a mask with a long, curved beak. This is what we now call the plague doctor. But here's the twist. This wasn't some advanced medical solution. It was guesswork. Pure desperation dressed up as protection. People believed the disease spread through bad air, so they stuffed the beak with herbs, flowers, anything with a strong smell, hoping it would filter out death itself. And here's a shocking fact. Many of these doctors weren't even trained physicians. Some were just hired because no one else was willing to go near the sick. Now imagine you're seeing one of them for the first time. You're already terrified, already unsure what's happening, and then this figure walks past you. Silent, almost inhuman, with glass eyes and a beak full of herbs. It doesn't look like help. It looks like a warning. And in many ways, it was. Because when a plague doctor showed up, it usually meant one thing: someone nearby was already dying. These doctors would move from house to house, not necessarily to cure, but to document, isolate, and sometimes just observe. Treatment, by modern standards, was almost non-existent. Bloodletting, burning herbs, applying strange mixtures to the skin, methods that often weaken the body even more. And here's something that might surprise you. Some treatments may have actually increased the spread because they required close contact. So the very act of trying to heal someone could make everything worse. Back in your isolated space, hearing stories like this doesn't bring comfort, makes things heavier. Because now you realize something. There is no real solution out there. Just people trying things and hoping. And hope, at this point, is fragile. You might even start to question, would you want a plague doctor to come? Because their presence doesn't guarantee survival. If anything, it confirms danger. And here's a disturbing detail from historical records. Some families refused to call for help at all. They hid the sick, kept doors closed, avoided attention because once authorities knew, houses could be marked, sealed, or even abandoned. Think about that level of fear. Not just of the disease, but of the response to it. Now let's talk about the mask itself for a second. Because this is where the medieval logic really shows. The beak wasn't random. Could be up to 6 inches long, filled with materials like lavender, mint, cloves, even vinegar-soaked sponges. The idea was simple. If bad smells cause disease, then strong good smells must block it. And honestly, if you didn't know about bacteria, it kinda makes sense. But here's the shocking part. While it didn't cure the plague, this outfit may have accidentally offered some protection. Not because of the IRBs, but because it created a physical barrier. Thick clothing, gloves, distance from patients, all things that, by coincidence, reduced exposure. So without realizing it, they were brushing up against the concept of protective gear, just for the wrong reasons. And this is what makes this chapter of history so unsettling. It's not just about death, it's about people trying to make sense of something invisible, using the tools and beliefs they had. Some ideas helped a little, some made things worse, but none of them gave certainty. And that's the part that really gets to you. Because imagine living in a world where even the people meant to save, you look like something out of a nightmare, where every solution feels like a gamble, and where survival might depend more on distance than care. And just when you think things couldn't get stranger, in the next chapter, something completely unexpected begins to happen. Not sickness, not silence, but movement, endless, uncontrollable movement. And it's going to challenge everything you think you understand about this time. Now here's the strange part. After a while, people actually got used to seeing plague doctors. I know that sounds insane, but think about it. When something terrifying becomes part of your daily life, your brain starts treating it as normal. A figure that once looked like death itself walking through the streets slowly turns into just another sign that things are bad. And that shift is dangerous, because when fear becomes routine, people stop reacting the way they should. Some started believing they were somehow immune, just because they hadn't gotten sick yet. Others began taking small risks, meeting someone briefly, opening doors, accepting deliveries. Not because they were careless, but because constant fear is exhausting. And here's a shocking fact. In several historical accounts, outbreaks spiked again after periods where people briefly relaxed, thinking the worst had already passed. At the same time, plague doctors themselves were dealing with something we rarely think about: the mental toll. Imagine walking into house after house, knowing most of the people you see won't survive, writing down names, symptoms, watching entire families collapse within days. And remember, many of them weren't even properly trained. They were just there because someone had to be. Some records describe doctors who stopped trying to treat patients altogether and focused only on documenting deaths. Not out of cruelty, but because they realized their methods weren't working. And here's something unsettling. There were cases where plague doctors refused to get too close to patients. Even while treating them, they would stand at a distance, giving instructions, avoiding touch whenever possible. So the image we have of a healer comforting the sick, that was often not the reality. Back in your space, hearing about these figures doesn't bring relief. It creates a different kind of fear, because now you understand something important. Even the people meant to help are unsure, and uncertainty spreads faster than any disease. You start noticing every small detail, every cough, every shift in the air, every sound behind walls. You might even begin to question yourself. What if I'm already infected and just don't know it yet? That thought alone was enough to break people. There are descriptions from that time of individuals isolating themselves completely, not because they were sick, but because they were afraid they might be. And in some cases, they stayed isolated until they either recovered from nothing or died alone from something else entirely. Now here's where things take a darker turn, because as the death toll kept rising, systems started collapsing. Not just emotionally, but structurally. Fewer workers meant food supply chains broke down. Fewer officials meant laws weren't enforced properly. In some places, bodies weren't collected for days. And when society starts to weaken like that, people begin to act differently. Some became more compassionate, helping where they could. But others went the opposite way. Theft increased. Abandoned homes were looted. And here's a shocking detail. There are reports of people pretending to be plague doctors not to help, but to gain access to homes and steal valuables from the dying or dead. When survival is uncertain, morality starts to shift. And just when you think this is already the lowest point, something even more bizarre begins to appear. Not silence, not sickness, but chaos in a completely different form. People in the streets, moving, not running, not escaping, but dancing non-stop, without control, without rest. It sounds almost impossible, but it happened, and not just once. And in the next chapter, we're going to step into one of the strangest and most disturbing phenomena of the medieval world, where the human body itself becomes part of the mystery. Alright, now this is where things stop making sense in a completely different way. Because up until now, everything we've talked about, fear, sickness, Cthulhu can still somehow connect it. Even if it's terrifying, it follows a pattern. But what happens next? It breaks the pattern entirely. Imagine walking through a town that's already half empty, already quiet, already carrying that heavy feeling in the air, and then you see someone in the distance, moving, not running, not working, just moving in a strange, repetitive way. At first you think maybe they're celebrating something. Maybe they've lost their mind from stress. But then you get closer, and you realize they're dancing, not casually, not joyfully, but intensely, uncontrollably, like their body won't let them stop. And here's the unsettling part, they're not alone. Because within hours, more people join. Not by choice, not because they want to, but because something pulls them into it. 1 becomes 5. 5 becomes 20. And before long, you have groups of people dancing in the streets for hours. Sometimes days, no music, no rhythm that makes sense, just constant movement. Arms flailing, feet pounding against the ground, bodies pushing past exhaustion. And here's a shocking fact. There are historical records describing people dancing until their feet bled, collapsing from fatigue and then being dragged aside, while others kept going. No one fully understood why it was happening. Some thought it was divine punishment. Others believed it was possession. But whatever it was, spread. Not like the plague, but in a way that was just as disturbing to witness. Now imagine how this looks through your eyes. Already shaped by fear and uncertainty, you've seen sickness, you've heard whispers, you've watched society slowly unravel, and now, suddenly, people are losing control of their own bodies in public. It doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like something bigger, something unnatural. And that's exactly how people at the time interpreted it. Many believed this dancing was a curse sent by a saint or a punishment for sin. In some places, they even tried to treat it by encouraging the dancers to keep going, thinking they needed to release whatever force had taken over them. Let that sink in. People were literally told to dance it out, even as their bodies were breaking down. And in many cases, that only made things worse. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. Modern historians have tried to explain this phenomenon, often called the dancing plague. And one theory points to something called ergot poisoning, toxin that can grow on rye bread, which was a staple food at the time. This toxin can cause hallucinations, spasms, and uncontrollable movements. So it's possible that what people were experiencing wasn't supernatural, but chemical. Still, that explanation doesn't fully solve the mystery, because ergot doesn't easily explain the scale of these events, or why they seemed to spread socially. And here's another shocking detail. Some outbreaks lasted weeks. Not hours, weeks. Entire groups of people trapped in a cycle of movement, exhaustion and collapse, while others stood around watching, unsure whether to help or stay away. And that's the part that really gets to you, because just like the plague, this wasn't something people could clearly understand or control. It blurred the line between physical illness and psychological breakdown, between body and mind, between reality and belief. And if you were living in that moment, already overwhelmed by everything else, this would feel like the final confirmation that the world itself was unraveling, not just through death, but through behavior, through loss of control, through something invisible that could take hold of you at any moment. And the worst part, you wouldn't know if you were next. Alright? Now imagine you're not just watching this anymore. You're standing close enough to hear it. Not music, but the sound of feet scraping against stone, uneven breathing, the occasional cry, when someone's body starts to give out, but they still can't stop moving. And here's what really makes it unsettling. Their faces. This isn't joy, it's not celebration, it's exhaustion mixed with something else, almost like panic trapped inside movement. Some are crying while they dance, some are shouting things that don't make sense, and others look completely detached, like they're no longer fully present. If you've ever seen someone push their body past its limit, you know that look. Now imagine dozens of people like that, all at once, in the middle of a town that's already drowning in fear. And here's a shocking detail. There are accounts describing musicians being brought in not to stop the dancing, but to control it, as if giving it rhythm might somehow contain it. Now pause and think about that decision for a second. Instead of isolating the dancers, instead of stopping them, people tried to organize the chaos. They built stages. They hired musicians. They created space for the movement to continue. Why? Because some believed the only way to cure it was to let it run its course. In their minds, the body needed to release whatever force had taken over. And honestly, if you didn't understand the cause, it might feel like the only option. But here's where it gets darker. The more structured it became, the more visible it became. Crowds gathered, spectators watched, and in some cases, the event started to attract attention, like a spectacle. Not entertainment exactly, but something people couldn't look away from. And that kind of attention can amplify behavior. It creates a loop movement, draws a crowd. The crowd feeds the movement, and suddenly something that started small becomes impossible to contain. Back in your position, hearing about this doesn't just confuse you, it adds another layer of fear. Because now it's not just about avoiding sickness. It's about avoiding something you don't even fully understand. What if it's not just physical? What if it's something that spreads through sight, or sound, or stress itself? That idea might sound strange now, but back then it made sense. People didn't separate mental and physical health the way we do. Everything was connected: body, spirit, environment. And here's a shocking fact. Modern researchers sometimes describe these events as a form of mass psychogenic illness, where stress and fear manifest physically and spread through groups. In other words, the environment itself, fear, death, uncertainty may have pushed people to a breaking point, where the body reacted in extreme ways. Now, let's talk about the physical toll, because this is where it becomes almost unbearable to imagine. Dancing non-stop isn't just tiring, just destructive. Muscles tear, joints weaken. Dehydration sets in quickly, especially if people aren't eating or drinking properly. Some accounts mention people collapsing with injuries, being dragged away only to be replaced by others still moving. And here's the part that stays with you: some didn't collapse because they chose to stop. They collapsed because their bodies simply couldn't continue. There are even mentions of heart failure and strokes linked to these episodes. So what you're seeing isn't just strange behavior, a slow physical breakdown happening in public with no clear way to intervene, and the longer it goes on, the more helpless everyone around feels. And this is where something deeper begins to settle in, because between the plague and this uncontrollable dancing, a pattern starts to form, not of cause and effect, but of uncertainty. Two completely different phenomena, both poorly understood, both spreading in ways that feel unpredictable. And when people are faced with that kind of unpredictability, they start looking for answers anywhere they can find them. Religion, superstition, authority, anything that offers even a hint of explanation. But what happens when those systems don't deliver? What happens when the people you trust most can't protect you? That's where the next shift begins, because in the next chapter, we're going to see what happens when faith itself is tested, and why the very places people ran to for safety may have become the most dangerous of all. Alright? So after everything we've seen, the sickness, the silence, the strange, uncontrollable dancing, you'd think people would run toward the one place that promises certainty, right? The one place that tells you there's meaning behind suffering, that there's protection, that there's a reason. And that place in 1348 was the church. It wasn't just a building, it was the center of life. Guidance, comfort, answers. Everything pointed there. So when things started falling apart, people didn't scatter randomly. They gathered inside chapels, cathedrals, small parish churches, shoulder to shoulder, praying harder than they ever had before, confessing sins, begging for mercy, hoping that if they just showed enough devotion, something, anything, would change. And for a moment, it probably felt like the right thing to do. Because when the world outside makes no sense, faith gives you structure. But here's where things take a turn that no one expected. The very act of gathering, of coming together in enclosed spaces, breathing the same air, touching the same, surface size created the perfect conditions for the disease to spread. And remember, they didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand transmission. So from their perspective, they were doing everything right, and still getting worse. That's what makes it so unsettling, because it creates a contradiction you can't resolve. You pray more, and more people die. You gather in sacred spaces, and sickness follows. And here's a shocking fact. In some regions, clergy mortality rates were significantly higher than the general population, not because they were weaker, but because they were constantly exposed. Hearing confessions, visiting the sick, performing last rites, the more devoted they were, the more at risk they became. Now imagine how that feels from the inside. You're already afraid. You're already unsure, and now the place you trusted most starts to feel unreliable, not necessarily wrong, but not protective in the way you expected. You might start asking questions you've never asked before. Why isn't this stopping? Why are the people closest to God getting sick too? And those questions don't just stay in your head, they spread. Quietly at first, whispered between people, then more openly, because when shared belief starts to crack, it doesn't break all at once, it fractures. Some people held on tighter, doubling down on prayer, convinced that the solution was even more devotion. Others began to feel something else creeping in, doubt, and that doubt led to extreme responses. In some places, groups known as flagellants began traveling from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as a form of penance. They believed the plague was punishment and that pain could redeem them. Imagine seeing that. People marching, chanting, bleeding in the streets, convinced that suffering was the only way out. And here's the shocking part. These gatherings often attracted crowds, which again helped spread the disease further. So even attempts at repentance could unintentionally make things worse. It's like every solution had a hidden consequence. Every effort to fix the problem created a new layer of it. And this is where the tension really builds. Because now it's not just about fear of death, it's about uncertainty in belief. The systems that once gave people clarity are now part of the confusion. Not because they failed intentionally, but because they were never designed to handle something like this. And when belief systems are tested under pressure, people react in very different ways. Some become more faithful, some become disillusioned, and some start looking elsewhere for answers. Because if the place that promised safety can't guarantee it, then where do you go next? That question is going to lead us into one of the darkest shifts yet. Survival starts to override everything else, even the most basic human bonds. So let's stay in that moment where belief starts to feel uncertain. Not completely gone but shaken, because that's where things quietly begin to change in a deeper way. When people no longer feel protected by what they trusted most, they don't just sit still, they adapt. And sometimes those adaptations aren't noble or heroic, they're practical, even uncomfortable. You start seeing fewer gatherings, fewer open doors, fewer acts of closeness. Not because people stopped caring, but because they started calculating risk in a way they never had before. And here's the unsettling shift. Survival slowly begins to move ahead of compassion. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small, quiet decisions. A door that stays closed. A visit that doesn't happen. A voice that goes unanswered. And each of those decisions, on its own, feels understandable. But together, they reshape society. Now imagine what that does to families. This isn't just happening between strangers, it's happening inside homes. There are historical accounts describing situations where one member of a household falls sick and the rest begin to distance themselves. At first, maybe it's subtle less contact, more caution, but as fear grows, that distance can become complete separation. And here's a shocking fact that still feels hard to process. There are records suggesting that in some cases, parents avoided their own children, and children avoided their parents not out of lack of love, but out of fear of infection. Think about how extreme the situation has to be for instinct itself to be overridden. Because normally, in danger, people come closer together. But here, danger is closeness. And this is where something called what we might now think of as the great abandonment starts to take shape. Not as a single event, but as a pattern. People leaving towns, servants leaving employers, workers leaving responsibilities, even caregivers leaving patients. Not because they wanted to, but because staying felt like a guaranteed risk. And once enough people start making that choice, systems begin to collapse. Food isn't delivered. Fields aren't maintained. Basic services stop functioning. And here's a detail that really shows how far things went. In some regions, laws had to be introduced to force certain professions like gravediggers or medical workers to continue their duties, because too many had simply walked away. When survival is uncertain, obligation becomes negotiable. Back in your position inside that confined space. Hearing all of this doesn't just make the world feel dangerous, it makes it feel distant, like the connections that once defined everyday life are slowly thinning out. You might start noticing it even in yourself. Hesitation, second thoughts, moments where you choose not to act. Not because you don't care, but because you're weighing outcomes. And that internal shift is one of the most significant parts of this entire period. Because it doesn't leave visible marks, like illness does, but it changes behavior in lasting ways. It rewrites what feels normal. And here's the thing, once behavior changes at that level, it doesn't immediately snap back even when the danger passes. And this is where the real weight of the situation settles in. Because by now, it's not just about a disease moving through populations. It's about a transformation happening within people. How they think, how they respond, how they define responsibility. And none of it feels stable. Some hold on to old values. Some adapt quickly. Some withdraw completely. But everyone is adjusting in some way. And as these changes ripple outward, they begin to shape what comes next. Because when a society goes through something like this, it doesn't come out the same. The structures might remain, but the mindset shifts. And in the next chapter, we're going to start seeing what those long-term changes look like, and how something so devastating could end up reshaping the entire medieval world in ways no one at the time could have imagined. So, after everything we've seen, the fear, the breakdown of trust, the way people slowly started choosing survival over connection, you might expect things to just keep getting worse until nothing is left. But history doesn't always move in a straight line like that. Sometimes, right in the middle of collapse, something unexpected starts to happen. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, subtly, almost in a way that people at the time wouldn't even recognize as change. Because while death is still everywhere, while uncertainty hasn't gone away, The sheer scale of loss begins to create gaps, empty spaces in society that didn't exist before, and those gaps, they start to shift the balance of power in ways no one planned. Now think about this for a second. If a huge portion of the population disappears in a short period of time, what happens to everything they used to do? The fields they worked, the shops they ran, the roles they filled. Someone has to take over, or those things stop functioning entirely. And here's where it gets interesting suddenly. Labor becomes valuable in a way it never was before. Workers who once had no leverage, no voice, no choice, now find themselves in a different position. There are fewer people, but the same amount of land, the same amount of work that needs to be done. And here's a shocking fact. In some regions after the Black Death, wages actually began to rise because there simply weren't enough workers to meet demand. Let that sink in. Out of one of the deadliest events in history came a shift that gave ordinary people more bargaining power. But of course, that kind of shift doesn't happen without resistance, because the people who held power before landowners, nobles, authorities, they weren't exactly eager to lose control. They were used to a system where labor was abundant and easily replaceable. Now, suddenly, that system doesn't work the same way. Workers can refuse. They can negotiate. They can leave. And that creates tension. Laws start being introduced to try and control wages, to force people back into old roles, to maintain the previous structure. But here's the problem: once people experience even a small change in freedom, it's hard to push them completely back. So what you get is this quiet push and pull between old systems trying to hold on, and new realities slowly reshaping them. From your perspective, living through this, it might not feel like opportunity at all. It still feels like loss, like absence, like everything familiar has been disrupted. But at the same time, you might start noticing small differences. Maybe you knew someone who would never have had a say before is now making decisions, taking on responsibilities, moving into roles that used to be out of reach. Maybe you notice that certain rules aren't enforced as strictly anymore, not because they've been removed, but because there simply aren't enough people to enforce them. And here's something people often overlook. Large-scale disruption doesn't just break systems, it loosens them. It creates space where new patterns can form. And this is where the story starts to shift from pure survival to adaptation. Not everyone benefits. Not everyone recovers. But the structure of society itself begins to change, piece by piece. And the people living through it don't necessarily see it as progressed, they just see it as different. Because when you're inside the moment, you're not thinking about long-term impact. You're thinking about getting through the day. But from a distance, we could see it clearly. This period didn't just take lives. It altered the direction of an entire era. And in the next part, we're going to look at how these changes didn't just affect work or power, but the way people thought about life itself, and what really mattered when everything felt temporary. Now that things have shifted a little quietly, almost in the background, you start to notice something deeper changing, not just in systems or work, but in how people think. Because when you've lived through constant uncertainty, when you've seen how quickly everything can disappear, your priorities don't stay the same. Things that once felt permanent suddenly feel fragile. Plans feel less certain, and the idea of later starts to lose its meaning. You begin to understand, in a very real way, that life isn't guaranteed to stretch out the way you once assumed. And that realization doesn't always make people cautious. Sometimes it does the opposite. Because here's what often happens when people are surrounded. By loss, they either withdraw, or they lean harder into living. And during this time, you see both. Some people become more reserved, more careful, holding tightly to what they still have. But others begin to live more intensely. They spend what they have. They celebrate when they can. They focus on the present in a way that might seem reckless from the outside, that makes complete sense when tomorrow is uncertain. And here's a shocking fact. There are historical descriptions of groups who deliberately chose pleasure over caution, gathering for meals, music, and conversation not because they ignored the danger, but because they refused to let fear define every moment. It wasn't denial, it was a different kind of response to the same reality. At the same time, something else begins to shift how people view wealth and status. Before all of this, social position felt fixed. You were born into a role, and that role stayed with you. But now, with so many lives lost and so many positions left open, movement becomes possible. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but enough to be noticeable. And when people see that change is possible, even in small ways, it alters how they think about their place in the world. Here's another surprising detail. In some areas, individuals who survived the plague inherited property, land, or responsibilities they never would have had access to before. Entire family lines ended, and with them the old structure of ownership. So while loss remained at the center of everything, it also created unexpected openings. From where you're standing, though, it still doesn't feel like opportunity, it feels like imbalance. The world you understood no longer works the same way, and the new version hasn't fully formed yet. That in-between space can feel unstable. You might find yourself questioning things you never questioned before. What actually matters? What's worth holding on to? What's worth risking? And those questions don't have easy answers, but they start to shape behavior in subtle ways. People become more aware of time, more aware of choice. Even small decisions begin to carry more weight, because they're no longer taken for granted. And that awareness stays, even as the immediate danger slowly begins to pass. And this is where the long-term impact really takes root. Because what began as a crisis of survival gradually becomes a shift in mindset. Not overnight, not all at once, but steadily. The experience leaves a mark, not just on the population, but on culture, values, and expectations. And while the world will eventually stabilize again, it won't return to exactly what it was before. Something has changed quietly, deeply, permanently. And in the next chapter, we're going to step back and look at what happens after the worst has passed. When the silence isn't just fear anymore, but the aftermath of everything that's been lost and everything that's been reshaped. Now we arrive at a moment that feels quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It's the kind of quiet that comes after everything has already happened. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, fewer signs of life, and at first you might think, maybe it's over. Maybe the worst has passed. But then you look closer and you realize this isn't recovery yet. This is the aftermath. And the aftermath has its own weight. Because when something this massive moves through a society, it doesn't just leave empty space, it leaves questions. What now? Who's left? And how do you even begin to rebuild when so much of what you knew is gone? And here's the unsettling part. There is no clear signal that tells people it's safe again. No announcement. No turning point. Just a slow, uncertain shift where the fear doesn't disappear. It just fades unevenly. Now imagine stepping outside after being inside for so long. The air feels the same, but everything else feels different. Houses that used to be full are now closed or abandoned. Fields that were once active are overgrown or unattended. You might pass by places that should be familiar, but feel strangely distant, like something is missing even if you can't immediately name it. And here's a shocking fact. In some regions, entire villages were left empty and never fully rebuilt. Not temporarily, over time, nature simply took them back. Structures decayed, paths disappeared, and what used to be a community became nothing more than a memory. That's the scale we're talking about. Not just disruption, but erasure. But at the same time, life doesn't completely stop. It can't. The people who remain begin to move again, slowly. Not with confidence, but with necessity. Food still needs to be found. Shelter still needs to be maintained. And in that process, something subtle starts to happen. People begin interacting again, carefully, cautiously. There's hesitation in every encounter, like an invisible distance that didn't exist before. Even conversations feel different, shorter, more measured, because trust doesn't just come back automatically. And here's something people don't always consider after a crisis like this. The absence of others can be just as impactful as their presence once was. You don't just notice who's there, you constantly notice who isn't. Now let's talk about memory, because this is where things take a deeper turn. The people who survive carry with them everything they've seen, every loss, every decision, every moment of uncertainty. And those experiences don't just fade away. They shape how people think moving forward. Some become more cautious, more reserved, less willing to take risks. Others develop a kind of resilience, a quiet understanding that they've already faced something extreme and made it through. But here's the complicated part. There's no single way people respond. Two individuals can go through the same event and come out completely different. And when that happens across an entire population, it creates a society that's harder to predict, harder to define. And this is where rebuilding becomes more than just physical, it becomes psychological. It's not just about repairing structures or restoring routines. It's about re-establishing a sense of normal. And that's not something you can force. It takes time. It takes repeated interactions. It takes moments where nothing bad happens, over and over again, until people start to believe it might stay that way. But even then, the memory of what happened doesn't disappear, lingers in the background, influencing decisions in ways that aren't always obvious. And that lingering effect is what carries forward into the next phase of this story. Because even as things begin to stabilize, the world that's emerging isn't the same as the one that came before. So even as things start to look calmer on the surface, there's something underneath that hasn't really settled yet. Because recovery isn't just about fewer people getting sick, it's about whether people feel safe again. And that part takes much longer. Imagine walking through a place that used to be full of life. But now every corner reminds you of someone who's no longer there. You don't just see buildings, you see absences. You remember who lived there? Who used to stand in that doorway? Who used to walk that path? And here's the thing, those memories don't fade quickly. They linger, quietly shaping how you move, how you speak, even how you trust. So even when the danger isn't as visible anymore, the feeling of it is still present, like an echo that hasn't fully disappeared. Now let's talk about something people don't always expect after a crisis like this. How normal routines feel unfamiliar. Things that once felt automatic now require thought. Gathering with others feels different. Sharing space feels different. Even something as simple as a handshake or its medieval equivalent carries a moment of hesitation. And here's a surprising detail. Historical patterns suggest that after large outbreaks, social behaviors often shift for years, sometimes generations. Not always in obvious ways, but in small habits, more distance, more caution, more awareness of proximity. It's not written down as a rule, but it becomes part of how people operate. And when enough individuals adopt those small changes, it subtly reshapes the culture as a whole. At the same time, there's this quiet pressure to move forward, to rebuild, to restore, to get things working again. Authorities want stability. Communities want structure. And so systems begin to reform, markets reopen. Roles are reassigned, responsibilities return. But here's the catch. The people filling those roles aren't the same as before. They've changed. Their experiences have altered how they approach decisions, risk, and responsibility. And here's a shocking fact. In some places, entire generations grew up with the memory of the plague as a defining part of their worldview, influencing how they handled future crises, conflicts, and even everyday interactions. So what you're seeing isn't just recovery. It's adaptation layered on top of memory. Your perspective, this creates a strange, in-between feeling. Life is continuing, but it doesn't feel fully stable. There's a sense that things could go wrong again, even if there's no immediate sign of it. And that awareness changes behavior in subtle ways. You might plan more cautiously. You might avoid unnecessary risks. Or, depending on your mindset, you might do the opposite, deciding that since nothing is guaranteed, you might as well act while you can. And that split in behavior becomes part of the new reality. Some people lean into security. Others lean into immediacy. And both responses make sense given what they've experienced. And this is where the long shadow of 1348 really becomes clear. Because even after the immediate crisis fades, its effects continue to ripple outward through decisions, through culture, through the way people understand life itself. It's not just an event that happened and ended. It's something that reshaped how people think about uncertainty, control, and survival. And as time moves forward, those changes don't just stay contained, they influence what comes next. Because the world that's rebuilding now is carrying lessons fears, and adaptations that will quietly shape the future in ways that aren't always obvious, but are always there. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because up until now, we've been inside the experience, what it feels like, what people saw, what they went through. But here's where things get interesting in a different way. Because when something this massive happens, it doesn't just affect one town, one region, or one group of people. It reshapes an entire world, even if the people living in it don't fully realize it yet. And that's exactly what 1348 did. It didn't just bring death, it forced a reset. Not instantly, not cleanly, but gradually. Systems that had been in place for centuries suddenly became unstable. Assumptions people never questioned started to crack. And when that happens, even small changes can lead to something much bigger over time. Now think about the structure of medieval life before all of this. It was rigid, predictable. Your role was largely defined by where you were born. Movement between classes was rare. Authority was centralized, and then suddenly a huge portion of the population disappears. That kind of loss doesn't just leave gaps. It weakens the systems holding everything in place. Labor shortages shift power. Land becomes available. Opportunities, limited, uneven, but real, begin to appear. And here's a shocking fact. In the decades following the Black Death, some historians link these changes to the gradual decline of feudal systems in parts of Europe, not because people decided to abandon them overnight, but because the conditions that supported them no longer existed in the same way. The structure didn't collapse all at once, started to loosen. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. These changes didn't feel like progress to the people living through them. They felt like instability. Imagine being in a world where the rules you've always known are shifting, but no one has clearly explained the nuance yet. You might notice differences, wages changing, roles shifting, expectations becoming less fixed, but it doesn't come with a clear narrative. It just feels different, and that uncertainty can be uncomfortable, because humans tend to prefer stable systems, even imperfect ones, over unpredictable ones. So while some people adapted quickly, others resisted, trying to hold on to what was familiar, even if it no longer fit the new reality. At the same time, something else begins to shift: how knowledge and experience are valued. When traditional structures weaken, people start relying more on observation, on practical understanding, on what actually works. It's subtle, but it matters, because over time, that shift can influence how people approach problems, how they think about cause and effect, even how they question existing beliefs. And here's an interesting detail. Some historians argue that the long-term effects of the Black Death contributed, in part, to broader cultural and intellectual changes that would emerge later. Not directly, not immediately, but as one of many factors that slowly reshaped how people saw the world. And this is where the story moves beyond survival and into transformation. Because what started as a crisis begins to ripple outward, affecting systems, beliefs, and behaviors in ways that extend far beyond the original event. The people living through it may not connect all the dots, but the impact is there, building over time. And in the next part, we're going to look at how these changes don't just stay in the background. They start influencing how people prepare for the future. how they respond to new challenges, and how the memory of 1348 continues to shape decisions long after the immediate danger has passed. So now we're in that strange phase where the immediate danger has passed, but the memory of it hasn't, and that memory starts doing something. Interesting, it begins to influence how people prepare for the future, even if they don't fully realize it, because once you've experienced something like 1348, you don't go back to thinking the same way. You can't. The idea that life is stable, predictable, and safe by default, that's gone. Instead, there's this quiet awareness in the background that things can change fast. Really fast. And here's the subtle shift. People start building their lives with that possibility in mind, not always consciously, but it shows up in how they store food, how they manage distance, how they respond to rumors of sickness in nearby towns. Even whispers of illness can trigger reactions that didn't exist before. Now imagine hearing that a village a few miles away has started seeing symptoms again. Before 1348, that might not have meant much to you, but now it changes everything. You pay attention, you listen more carefully, you start noticing patterns: who's been traveling, who's been in contact with whom. And here's a shocking fact. In the years following major outbreaks, some communities began implementing early forms of what we now recognize as quarantine, not because they understood disease scientifically, but because they had learned through experience that limiting contact could slow whatever was happening. Ships were sometimes held offshore before being allowed to dock. Travelers were watched more closely. It wasn't consistent or perfectly applied, but it was a step toward something new, responding based on observation rather than assumption. At the same time, there's another layer to this: how authority adapts. Because leaders, whether local or regional, can't ignore what just happened. Too many lives lost, too much disruption. So they start trying to create systems that can handle future crises better. Regulations, guidelines, sometimes strict measures meant to control movement or enforce certain behaviors. But here's where it gets complicated. People don't always trust those systems completely. After everything they've seen, after realizing that even established structures couldn't fully protect them, there's a degree of skepticism that lingers. So what you get is this push and pull, authorities trying to impose order, and individuals deciding for themselves how much to follow based on their own judgment and past experience from your perspective living in this world. It feels like you're always balancing two things. On one side, the desire to move forward, to rebuild, to live normally again. On the other, the memory of how quickly things fell apart. And that balance shapes behavior in subtle ways. You might still gather with others, but with a bit more awareness. You might still travel, but with hesitation. Or you might choose to stay closer to what feels familiar. And here's something that often gets overlooked. These kinds of behavioral shifts don't disappear when the event ends. They become part of the culture, passed down through habits, stories, and cautionary attitudes. And this is where the long-term influence of 1348 really settles in, not just as a historical event, but as a reference point, something people remember, talk about, and quietly use to guide future decisions. It becomes a kind of invisible framework, shaping how societies respond to uncertainty, how they prepare, how they react when something unfamiliar appears again. And even though the people living through it might not describe it that way, the impact is real. Because once a society has faced something that challenges its understanding of control and safety, it doesn't fully forget, it adapts. And in the final chapter, we're going to bring all of this together, what it meant to live through this moment, what it changed, and why, even centuries later, it still feels strangely familiar. So, if you made it this far, just take a second and think about what you just experienced. Not a battle. Not a heroic story. Not a clean beginning and ending. Just people trying to survive something they didn't understand. That's what makes the year 1348 so unsettling. It's not loud in the way we expect history to be loud. It's quiet, slow, uncertain, and that quiet is where all the real decisions happen. The kind of decisions no one prepares you for. Do you open the door, or keep it closed? Do you stay, or do you leave? Do you help, even if it might cost you everything? And the truth is, there were no perfect answers. Only choices and consequences that followed. But here's the part that stays with you. Even in the middle of all that fear, confusion, and loss, life didn't stop. People adapted. They changed. They carried on, imperfectly, uncertainly, but forward, and maybe that's the real story here. Not just how fragile things can be, but how humans respond when everything familiar disappears. Because if there's one thing 1348 shows us, it's this. We don't need full understanding to keep going. We don't need certainty to move forward. Sometimes, we just need to make the next decision and live with it. So the next time you hear about history like this, don't just think about what happened. Think about what it felt like, because in the end, that's the part that connects us across time. And strangely enough, that's what makes even the darkest moments feel human. Now, you can finally rest.